Okay, go ahead and look to the Lord in a word of prayer. Pray for the word today, please.
We pray, our Heavenly Father, for the word as it goes forth today. We pray, our Father, that people will be blessed to hear this word and grow in Christ. We pray, our Heavenly Father, for our country. We pray for our country and other countries. We pray that the people would hear and be obedient to thy word. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, let's turn to the book of 1 Thessalonians, chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and we're looking at verse 21 and verse 22. Verse 21 and verse 22 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Prove all things. Hold fast to that which is good. All right, now remember that with these little phrases, we'll call them, they are called emphatics. We call them emphatics. There's a fact being brought out abruptly, so to speak, to catch our attention, and it would have been good if the Thessalonican believers would have done that. They might not have gotten into the error, both by doctrine and tradition, practically, if they had done so. But nonetheless, they are new Christians, and so let's understand that. We all of us need to be improving as believers. So, prove all things, but examine everything carefully. Let me translate how this would. Let me translate what these words would mean in sentence. But examine everything carefully. Hold fast to that which is good. Abstain from all evil. In the New American Standard, these two thoughts are grammatically placed together. Proving and abstaining. So first is this idea of proving. And by the way, this is this emphatic, like pray without ceasing, giving thanks in everything. These are to be done pragmatically and progressively all the time. Okay? So this idea of prove, it means to test. And I believe this does not apply to prophecies. In 1 Corinthians 14, let the prophets speak 2 or 3 and let the others judge. It is the expectation of approving, more like examining. More like examining. Practical application for our testimony. Look in the book of Romans for a moment, chapter 12. The book of Romans, chapter 12. And let's look, please, in verses 1 and 2. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Many times it's good to go back to what you already know to understand the new thing you're looking at. And so here in Romans chapter 12, notice verse 1, I spiritually constrain you, brethren, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your worshipful or rendered divine service. And notice, and be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove. There's our word. That ye may prove. You may examine. You may examine, approving. That what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Let's look in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. So, as the Christian believer, is yielding to God. He's to be one who's to be a spiritual living sacrifice. That kind of brings us into that realm of believer priests, doesn't it? What does God want more than anything? He wants you. He wants you. And He wants you to be a testimony for Him. And that would go along the lines of approving, examining. Look in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 8. I speak not by commandment, but by occasion of the earnestness of others, and approve, examine what? Not just love, but the sincerity of your love. Now, what is Paul referring to? Well, this has to do really with Timothy moving about the Gentile churches to gain from them support money for the Jerusalem church. And interestingly, remember in Jerusalem, if you became a believer and was baptized, publicly baptized, you're done. You're done. You're dead. I even know still, even today, traditional Judaism, that if someone converts, they have a funeral for you. Yeah. And so dead people don't need to eat, and dead people don't need to work, and dead people don't need to live. So in that society there, as a Jew in Jerusalem, you become a believer. The Jerusalem church was, well, they're on their own. And they had all things common that helped. But they needed support. And the Gentile churches, Paul saw to it. Remember when Paul and Barnabas at the very beginning, back there in the back of the book of Acts chapter 11, I believe, they were getting a gift and giving it to the church there in Jerusalem. And Barnabas had handed over all of his land there in Jerusalem and in that area. So they needed support. There was no way to support themselves. So the church took it upon itself to do that. So what Paul is saying will prove the sincerity of your love. Examine. We're going to examine that. In other words, interested more in action than we are words. Okay? Let's look in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5. Here Paul is really corrective at the end of this book. There's things going on that are listed up there in chapter 12, verse 20. Lest there be debates, envyings, wraths, strifes, backbitings, whisperings, conceit, disorders. Got quite a little recipe here for schism, don't we? In the body and division. So there's all of that. But notice in verse 5, examine yourselves. There's our word. That's our word. Whether you're in the faith, prove yourselves. Know ye not yourselves how Jesus Christ is in you, unless you are discredited. Examine yourselves. And then we have the word what? Prove yourselves. That's our word. It's almost like a double emphasis on the word examine. Now, the commentaries like to group this with exhortation about prophesying, but it is no doubt includes the issue, but it does not say only prove prophesying. It is the exhortation in general, as a general rule and balance. We don't play naive and simply accept everything. Wait a minute. I need to examine this. Okay? Let's look in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 10. We'll back up here for just a moment. Paul is talking about the Greek Roman Greek culture, and promoted in it, along with its pagan religion, was immorality. And so covetousness and fornication were promoted in that culture, just as it is today. It's promoted. It isn't just a matter of tolerate it or, oh well, you accept it. It's promoted. And so in their day, it was promoted also. And so he tells them in verse 7, "Be not ye therefore partakers with them. For ye were once darkness, but now are ye light in the Lord. Walk, live your life as children of light. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness and righteousness and truth, proving what is acceptable unto the Lord." And this idea of proving is not a Pharisaical idea of, well, I see Victor over there, and, well, he's driving a Ford, and I see Walter over there, he's driving a Toyota, and our poor brother in the back drives a Chevy. Well, that's a problem. No, it's not a Pharisaical judging. You see what I mean? It's not going about to promote oneself above another. That's not the idea at all. This examination is self-examination unto the Lord. It's examining oneself before God, seeing it as He sees it. Now that's an important aspect of this. Okay? Paul is, of all people, is not promoting Phariseeism. He once was a Pharisee of the Pharisees, remember? And then later on he tells us of sinners, I am chief. So what this exhortation is, the Holy Spirit's exhortation to the church, is examining as the Lord sees it before the Lord. Okay. Look in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and in verse 2. I'm sorry. Yes, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. 1 Thessalonians 2:4. Now there's another little aspect to this word, examining. It brings with it the idea of testing. And in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and in verse 2. But as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God. See that? Who testeth our hearts. Tries or proves. Tries or proves. One of the things I've learned in working in the secular world, in different places like PPG, who makes car paint in Delaware, and other products I've been. There's labs everywhere. It used to really bother me. I hate cleaning labs. They can never be clean enough, and no one's ever happy. And that's the way it should be, actually. But nonetheless, you'd go into, you have this big dirty plant, and in the middle of it is this very clean lab. And it seems like there's a lab every step of the way of the procedure. And the reason there is, and monitor rooms, and computer, and they can tell you exactly the levels and the tolerance and where this product's at and what's going wrong with it, where it's happening, all of that. They are constantly proving it. They're proving it every step of the way. Now, one reason, of course, is for quality, obviously. But also when something goes wrong. They're just as interested in that. Because they want to learn what happened that time And when we see it again, we'll know what to do with it so that we don't lose this product the next time. See? How's this behaving? What's it doing? What's causing that? What in the process triggered this to happen? And so forth. They're proving. They're examining it. All parts of the procedure are to be proven. So when that product comes out, one, it's consistent. You don't have paint that works one way one time and works a different way another time. You're probably not going to go buy that. All right, or whatever it is the product might be, that it's the same, that it meets that standard. You see. And so there needs to be the constant examining every step of the way in the procedure. All right, that's testing. They'll take, when it's being produced, you'll see people out running around these little metal cart things, and they're pulling something and they're writing down. They're writing the information down about that product, what it is, what line it's on, what time, all of that. And then they'll take that back and they'll pour it into their little beakers and their stuff, and away they go. They heat it up, they cool it down, they spray it, all of that stuff. Okay, that's what they do all day. And then a funny thing happens when something isn't right. They've proven it. Guess what happens to it? They dump it. If they can't fix it, it's got to go. Yeah, but there's just that little thing. That's it. That's not our product. Here's what we say our product is. And it's got to be that every time. And when we put it out there, it's that product every time. See? Well, in the Christian life, with our faith, we need to be proving all along the way, because we have a Christian walk that's going on. And we need to prove that experience. Now, there are times when we fail. And we ought not to have the oh well shucks attitude. Oh well shucks, maybe it'll turn out better next time. No, we need to prove that. Hey, where did this go wrong? What triggered this? When I see it again, I'll know what to do this next time, right? Right? And it's eventual, isn't it? Because the Christian life is an experimental walk. I remember once dealing with a dietitian, and he was a little bit anti-medical. He was pro whatever he was. I forget what they call them, but you can fix this yourself, by what you eat and how you do things. And so he said, always remember, Ted, when you go to the doctor, they call it a practice. And they call it a practice for a reason. Okay. Medical practice. And so, but that's true, isn't it, in life? And your problem may be different. You may have the same problem as someone else for different reasons. Right? Same problem, different reasons. Well, we need this proving. We need this self-examination, this testing. When we come to the Lord's table, look in the book of 1 Corinthians, if you will, please. The book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 11. We usually have an annual message on the communion, what we're supposed to be doing at the communion table. It's a very active table, isn't it? There's to be thanksgiving. There's to be remembrance. There's to be participation. There's to be a valuing. There's to be a submission and an obedience. And there's to be an examination. Not of everybody else, of yourself. And it says in verse 28, 11:28 of 1 Corinthians 11:28, but let a man examine whom? Himself. Himself. Religion would like to examine everybody else. Phariseeism examines the people of your own sect and how you measure up to them. None of that is what the Christian faith is interested in, may I say. It is interested in you examining yourself before God with what God thinks according to His standard. Our walk of faith is not for us and others. Our walk of faith is for the Lord, and it will have the effect on others that it needs to have. But it says, but let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup. It sounds like a prerequisite, doesn't it? That's why when we have a Lord's table here, all of the songs, the scripture, the message, all of it is on this topic. On the blood, on the body, the redeeming person of Christ. Why? Well, we need to be examining ourselves when we come to that table. Okay, let's go back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. In our Christian faith and walk and service and worship, examination begins with us. I call it go to the mirror and get that guy straightened out first. And then you might not have enough time for everybody else, I would imagine. We got plenty to work on, don't we? Our standing before the Lord is important in the Christian faith. Okay, hold fast to that which is good. Now, when you look at this emphatic, it's linked together grammatically here in verse 21. Both of these could stand alone in their sentence grammatically. That's why you have the semicolon. But they're put together because it's telling you your examination, what are we working toward in that examination? Okay? And it says, prove all things. Why? Why are we doing it? It's going to be quite an effort and quite an undertaking. So where are we going with this? You have a right to ask that, right? Where are we going with it? I've looked at myself. Whew, lot to work on. Goodness. Okay, well, where are we going with it? Well, this is to be the product. Hold fast to that which is good. Hold fast to that which is good. Now, there's more to this than what meets the eye. First of all, it's the point and to be the result of our examination. So we start with ourself before the Lord, and then there is a directive. There's a directive. There's to be a behavior that follows that. All right, and it is a steadfast adherence. Katak echo. Kata echo. That's the word in the Greek. I won't try that again. Okay? I'm not Greek. I try. It means to steadfast, have steadfast adherence. Kata means down. Echo means keep. Keep down, so to speak, that which is good. So as we see yet again, and I want to keep repeating this over and over, the Christian life is not passive and defensive. It's active and offensive. You're to be busy doing something. So let's look at that word for a minute. Look in the book of Hebrews, chapter 3, verse 6. What does this look like? And to understand that better, let's look in Scripture. That will help us. and I like to take biblical passages, and it helps us for further exhortation. Look in chapter 3 of Hebrews, verse 6. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 6. But Christ, as a son over his own house. We have the house of Moses, and he was faithful in all of his house, and there was much glory bestowed on that house. Well, how much more the house that Jesus Christ builds? And that's the discussion here in this section. Whose house we are. This house is a little different house. It's a spiritual, mystical union. It's the house of faith. If we hold fast the confidence, and by the way, that's what Hebrews is about. It's not about saving faith, although it's taught about in Hebrews, but the emphasis on Hebrews is persevering in the faith. So we have this word, it comes up rather often in the book, it says, hold fast. Steadfast adherence, the confidence, and the rejoicing of the confident expectation firm to the end. And that's what they needed, wasn't it? And we have an opposite example that comes up about the day of provocation. They didn't mix with faith what they heard. There was not a steadfast adherence. When it came time to follow God's word, to prove what is good, what happened? Apostasy. Failure. We're not going in. Imagine answering Jehovah back. Not going in. Boy. Oh my. I remember in Swaziland, it was just a brief moment, but the king dropped by. Not real sure. The queen wanted to speak to Daniel, so everything got put on hold, and I had to be a good boy about it, obviously. But you didn't disappoint the king. No matter how way out he is, okay? You'd never say, oh no, king, we're not doing that. I fear that your future career has a short fuse to that. Okay, and how you addressed him. Yes, Your Majesty. Yes, Your Majesty. You didn't call him sir. You didn't call him king. His Majesty. When the letters came from him, His Majesty service. I'm going to get off track a little bit. I remember once when Diana first came over with me to have the camp and the team meetings, and Daniel got an envelope, and it said His Majesty service. Daniel he does work. He has 2 or 3 posts there, by the way, and he showed it to everybody in the room, and he opened it, and he got this letter out, and he says, Diana is to be held in Swaziland for His Majesty service. Can't go home. He wanted that to happen. He wanted Diana to stay. I wanted to do it by the authority of His Majesty. Imagine telling the majestic God, no, we're not going in. After 40 years of God proving His faithfulness to Israel, they didn't have to do the fighting. He'll do the fighting. I will fight for you. He proved that not in a land of milk and honey, but in a desert, He could preserve them. Surely in a land of milk and honey with cities already built, He could preserve them, you see. We're not going in. What happened? They were not adhering steadfastly to the promises. They heard the promises. They experienced the promises. They saw it for 40 years. But when it came time to go into that promise, to go into that land, the answer is no. You see, that's why that verse comes right before this explanation. And also in view that the Hebrew believers were thinking of drawing back. And what is the exhortation? If, oh boy, always mark those statements. If we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the confident expectation, firm unto the end. Hold fast. Adhere steadfastly. Now, Israel didn't do that. And the Hebrew Christians here were in jeopardy of making the same mistake. They had started out well. Even the spoiling of their own goods, you find that out in Hebrews chapter 10. But they didn't have respect unto the recompense of reward. Hold fast. Now look in verse 14. For we are made partakers of Christ. If we hold the beginning of our confidence, there's our word, steadfast unto the end. Now, isn't it interesting that we have that thought before and after the Lord points out the day of provocation to these Hebrew believers? We go on in this discussion into chapter 4 and find they cannot enter into rest because they did not mix with faith the word when they heard it. That goes with this exhortation. That goes with this emphatic. We are to be what? Proving in our experience before God, examining all things. We don't take anything for granted. Right? Now, I'll give an illustration from the Word, from the book of Joshua. You remember Achan. And you remember how that in Jericho, they had a great victory. Now, that was a little different warring strategy and technique, wasn't it? They went around it 7 times. They were to blow the horn and so forth. And down came the walls. And that was all she wrote, right? Except for one place. Yeah. Rahab's place. With the scarlet robe, remember? That was to be preserved. And it was, by faith. Now, what happened during that great victory? Well, Achan decided somehow. He decided that he would partake. And he took the money and the gold and the garment and he did what? He hid it in his tent. He was not examining all things and proving what is good, was he? Somehow, he thought it'd be a good idea to have that for himself. Now, when would he bring it out? I don't know when he thought he would bring it out, because he sure couldn't bring it out right then, could he? Everybody'd know, Achan, where'd you get them robes? He'd be in trouble. So I guess he figured maybe down the line somewhere, I just got this, he's going to play his game, I guess. I don't know what he had in mind. But he certainly wasn't proving, examining. And when they went to little Ai, they were defeated. What a tremendous step backwards. And you remember when Joshua was praying, God said, up, get busy. Let's examine these guys. And he came to Achan, and he found that Achan had those things hidden in his tent. Didn't examine along the way, did he? And he ended up, him and his family, a heap of rock. So, that's the idea. All right, to keep down. The word good here is beneficial, like beneficial teaching. Good describes the intrinsic value of the teaching. So hold fast or steadfast adherence to the good teaching. Now, between these two statements and the next one, we have a contrast. Here we're adhering steadfastly to the good teaching. Our next emphatic is abstain from that which is evil. Okay? So let's look in 1 Thessalonians 5:15. Let's go back now to our context, if you will. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 15. Notice, see that none render evil for evil unto any, but pursue that which is good. Now, remember when we taught this, when we looked at that word pursue, that it takes every effort, every resource, everything we have. You're on the offensive. You don't have time for the evil. Different mindset. Different mindset. You're busy doing the good. All of yourself is moving that direction. There's no time for evil. Well, we're exhorted in these emphatics here that we're to prove and examining, testing all things, steadfastly adhering to the good teaching. Again, it's like what we have in the book of Galatians chapter 5, verse 16. Walk in the Spirit, and what? What will be the result? Yeah, you won't be walking in the lust of the flesh. Where we get into trouble is not that there's evil everywhere. There's always been evil everywhere. Where we get into trouble is when we're not pursuing that what we're supposed to. We're not where we need to be. We're not busy doing what we're supposed to be doing. And that's what happened later to these Thessalonians, isn't it? If they would have examined that letter, that false letter from the Judaizers, and they would have tested it with the tradition of doctrine that they knew and adhered to it, they would not have gotten taken away. They would not have been fooled. If they would have examined and they would have tested the traditional pragmatics of what they were shown, where Paul and Silas and Luke and Timothy worked night and day and were propagating the gospel, they would not have gotten into the idle tattler thing. Right? Idle, running about getting everybody else's business. They wouldn't have bought into that. Why? They'd have been busy pursuing the good teaching. Okay? Follow me? So the counter method, okay, the counter method is very simple. That we should be doing what we should be doing in the first place. All right? That's the fundamentals. To be worshiping and serving the Lord only, to be adhering to His instruction, and then to follow it. Right? To walk by faith. The basic, the fundamentals. And proving, experiencing that. Now notice in verse 22, abstain from all appearance of evil. He's not telling them to abstain from evil. We have a good report of this Thessalonican church. So please don't put them in an evil basket yet. We will in 2 Thessalonians. We'll get that done later. Later on. For right now, they were very busy in brotherly love, in implementing the faith, in moving forward in their walk with the Lord. Their testimony resounded throughout that no one needed to speak anything about it. Remember? Trumpeted forth is the propagation of the gospel from you, so that we need not say anything. So please don't take that and say, oh, the Thessalonians were... No, the Thessalonians were doing just fine. This emphatic deals with the appearance of evil. How it appears. Abstain from every form of evil. Now, that helps us a lot here, doesn't it? That translation. And that is how it should be translated out. To hold oneself from evil practices, moral and ceremonial. That's why that's there. Otherwise, we glance right over and say, yeah, let's not do that. Next. Whoops, wait a minute. No, there's a little bit more to it than what might meet the eye. It's to hold oneself back from moral and ceremonial evil. Look in the book of Acts chapter 15. Acts chapter 15, let's back up to verse 19. We've had the meeting at Jerusalem, the council at Jerusalem. We're going to put the Gentiles under ceremonial law of the Jew. Must one become proselyte, circumcised to have or to obtain the promise? What's the answer to that? No. The just live by faith. There is no difference. And that has been proclaimed. However, Jerusalem church would ask of us some things in our spiritual liberties, that we be careful. It's all right. Let me give you. I always like to give my old example of the bar. What's the name of that bar down there? Well, it's not. Okay. Okay, Leona. Okay, just I need to see you after. Okay, okay, all right. I know. Leona is upstanding. We don't need to worry about that. All right, I whipped down the road as I've been known to do, and you're going through. I've been told that's really not Frenchtown, but okay, it's Frenchtown to us. And there's my vehicle, and there I am walking in Wagner's, what is it? Roadhouse? Wagner's Roadhouse Bar. Don't you tell me that that's not going to cause a little bit of a question in your mind. Okay? What's going to be the question in your mind? What's Pastor Ted doing going into a place like that? Right? All right. You have a right to ask that. That's an appearance, morally, of evil. It's foolish for me to go there. There can't be anything in there that I can't get somewhere else. Right? So I'm thirsty and I want a drink of water. We don't need to go to the Wagner's Roadhouse Bar. All right, we can go to the little mini mart down the street and get a bottle of water. All right? Sure. You say, oh, I go there to evangelize. I think you can knock on doors and hit the same people. Hopefully. May not be sober, but nonetheless. All right. So we could come up with excuses. Now, is there anything unlawful or wrong for me to go in there. Maybe I like their hamburgers. I like the hamburgers at Roadhouse, Wagner's Roadhouse Bar. They fix them the way I like them. But there's an appearance of evil. And Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, I will not be brought under the power of any. Don't play with sin. It's powerful. Right? It's the appearance. Ceremonially and morally. So don't get the idea of we're talking about physical appearances and judging one another according to that. That's not what we're talking about. There's no Phariseeism here in these emphatics. So get that out of your head. That's not what it is, comparing one person to another. That's not these emphatics, has nothing to do with it. This is about getting you and I to think about our spiritual behaviors. Okay? And where we need to be found and not found. We need to be absent from any appearance. Why? Because of evil. Because of evil. So look in Acts 15, verse 19. Wherefore my judgment is that we trouble not them who from among the Gentiles are turned to God, but that we write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols, and from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood. Would you please do that for us? James is saying. Not that he would be okay with Gentiles committing fornication. But understand the Jewish mind in relation to the Gentile mind of that day. Okay? For Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. Understand how that Hebrew man is going to see that, and then you turn around and try to give him the gospel. Do you understand how that's going to go over? He's not hearing anything you got to say. Right? He knows what he saw. He said, well, Pastor Ted, now hold on there now. I have liberty in Christ. I can, not fornication obviously, but I can participate in these things. There's no difference in foods. If I have a steak that has a little, that is not well done, that's none of his business. Whoa. But his reception of the gospel is our business. Okay? And James, in God's wisdom, is saying if you could refrain from these things, sure would be helpful. Sure would be helpful, the gospel. No, we're not putting you under any of the legalism of the law. James is not promoting that. We've settled that. The just live by faith. It's not by keeping the law. Okay, we've got that down. Right? But you know what? There are those that are hearing the law of Moses. And then when they step out from under that and see you Gentiles doing this, they'll have no regard for the gospel. Verse 22. Then pleased it the apostles and elders with the whole church to send chosen men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, Judas surnamed Barsabbas, and Silas, chief men among the brethren. And they took that letter, and everywhere they went, they read it. And may I say, brethren, as the book of Romans says, do we destroy the body of Christ over foods? And I would think not. So it's more about thinking about how God sees it. You see what I mean by appearance? He's saying, please abstain from these things. It would be so helpful, because then when we need to preach the gospel, they'll listen. But if you've done this, and they see it, Nothing you say. They're iron curtain. They're not going to hear you. They don't know any better. They've not been enlightened. But certainly don't put up any hindrances. So if you could abstain from that, we'd so appreciate it. That's what they're saying from Jerusalem. Okay. Let's look in the book of 1 Thessalonians 4:3. 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3. For this is the will of God, even your sanctification, that ye abstain from what? Fornication. Abstinence. Now, abstinence has been used in our society here and around the world to fight against AIDS, right? But it's not done for necessarily moral reasons. It's done more for medical reasons. But friends, here, it is for spiritual reasons. The body doesn't belong to you and I, it belongs to the Lord, and therefore we should not be participating in such things. Abstain. To hold oneself back from. Look in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3. Here we see it used in the negative sense for the wrong reasons. And notice, forbidding to marry, to abstain from foods which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving by them who believe and know the truth. To keep oneself back from. Here it's the negative. Here a person is abstaining from foods when they ought to be participated in. You remember in the book of Acts, I believe it's chapter 11, when the sheet comes down from heaven and with all of these different animals, and the Lord tells Peter, what? Slay and eat. And Peter says, not so, Lord. All right, he was holding himself back from. That would be an idea of here. Now, to put one against another. And I kind of like to do this. Well, wait a minute, Pastor Ted. You just, you're yelling at me both ways. You just told me from what James wrote that I need to abstain from certain things because it's offensive. Now you're telling me this is wrong to abstain from those foods. Which way is it? Well, it's both, my brethren. It's both. When we're in the Jewish community and we're there to propagate the gospel, we opt to abstain, hold ourselves back from those things. Why? For their sake. For the Lord's testimony. So the gospel be propagated. You remember, Paul would not circumcise Titus. Would not do it because the fallacy and error was that one must be proselyte to be part of the promises. And Paul said, no, we won't be compelled to do that. The just live by faith. And you'll say, well, now, Pastor Ted, hold on there a minute. Didn't Paul circumcise Timothy? Because he knew that the Jews in those quarters knew that Timothy was the son of a Gentile. And I'll say yes, and isn't it wonderfully consistent? It is so that they would hear the gospel that the just shall live by faith. Okay? So, there we have an example. And we see it both ways. And that's important for us this morning. This is called maturity. It's called maturity. Look in the book of 1 Peter chapter 2, if you will, please. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. Ooh, I'm over. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. Peter's writing the scattered church, both Jew and Gentile, scattered throughout these quarters of Rome. And he's letting them know they're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people of his own, that they should be showing forth the praises of God. And notice in verse 11, dearly beloved, I